In the name of God, Creator, Christ, and Spirit, Amen. Come to me, all you that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Many of us over the years have fallen back on these words of Jesus to comfort us in times of trouble and pain. When we get physically ill, or we battle with mental illness, when our children are struggling, or when relationships prove difficult or end, or when those we love die, the list goes on. In all our strife, what may have kept many of us going are these words of Jesus. To have rest is sometimes what we yearn for the most. Just in this week alone, different people have shared their stories with me of physical and mental pain, of imprisonment, of addiction, and of grief. Sometimes the things that happen in our lives feel too much to bear, and they threaten to overwhelm us and sometimes destroy us. And so when we hear Jesus saying, "Come to me, all that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest," our response may well be, "Oh, yes, please. Take my pain, take my grief, and let me rest." These words of Jesus are often referred to as the words of assurance, words that are like an ice-cold drink on a blisteringly hot day, soothing, gentle, and refreshing. Some of us here, like me, come from the Anglican tradition, and these words of assurance will be very familiar to us as they're part of the Anglican liturgy's invitation to communion. They are repeated before the community gather around Christ's table. Come to me and find rest, Jesus says, just before we remember the story and share in the sacrament of bread and wine. Over the last few weeks, we have heard Jesus talking about mission. And in today's reading, it comes to an end as the whole scene shifts. John the Baptist is now in prison, and he has heard about Jesus and wants to know with certainty that he is Israel's Messiah. So he sends his disciples to ask Jesus. What follows from this question about Jesus' messiahship centers on the question of who John and Jesus are. When we meet new people, we immediately pick up on cues that tell us who they are. It's an innate human response as we try and work out if we are safe. Is this person like us or like them? Are they friend or are they foe? And those cues include many things, don't they? By the way I'm dressed, it's pretty clear that I'm a religious minister. Likewise, for a doctor or a nurse in a hospital, what they wear is a clear indicator. If I'm out for dinner with friends, however, it's not as simple to work out who I am. Perhaps you would take your cues from the people I'm hanging out with and try to gain an insight to who I am. So if I'm with my children or if I'm with my friends, give you a different part of that picture. And what becomes clear in today's story is that there are some major assumptions that the crowd make about who John and Jesus are based on what they look like and the company they keep. John is the strange prophet and social misfit who people assume is demon-possessed. And because Jesus hangs out with tax collectors and other varieties of sinners, they label him a glutton and a drunkard. The fact that people are so quick to dismiss a person based on their perceived affiliations is apparently nothing new. Jesus points out that God's will has been made known in more than one way through different mouthpieces, and yet God still isn't recognized. When we read about burdens and about yokes, we traditionally picture the oxen pulling the plough and the heavy piece of wood that goes across their necks that keep them attached to the plough and to each other. When we read this text in the context of the verses that surround it, we see that there may be another understanding. When Jesus refers to those who labor and are heavy laden, it's likely that he was referring specifically to those who were laboring under the demands of the Jewish Torah. So as we think of a yoke as an equipment for an animal, the term was often used in rabbinic literature to refer to the task of obedience to the Torah or the law. In order to obey the law, you must know the law. And Jesus wants those who are burdened to learn from him instead. The invitation is specifically one to abandon all attempts at self-righteousness under the law and to come to Jesus in faith instead. This sounds like a valid application of Christ's invitation, and yet the disturbing thing we find when we look at the verses that appear just before this one, we see that these words of assurance are not, as we might expect, a part of a series of declarations about the love of God for all God's creatures. They are instead part of Jesus venting his frustrations. But to what will I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to one another. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. People don't listen. They don't see, and they are very quick to write people off who confront their ideas about the world and how it should work. There really is no way of pleasing you people, Jesus vents at them. So it's into this setting that Jesus says these often quoted words about being heavy laden and coming to Jesus to find rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, Jesus says. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's very interesting to hear what Jesus is not saying in these verses. Jesus doesn't say, come to me and I will carry all your burdens for you. He doesn't say, come to me and I will make your burdens disappear. He doesn't say, I will make sure that your life will have no burdens. Despite all the warnings about rejection and suffering in the previous chapter, Jesus uses words like rest and easy and light burdens and easy yokes. And together they sound very much like a contradiction to our ears. How can we be rejected and yet find rest? How can we suffer and yet find rest? In other places in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus reminds his disciples that the gate is narrow and the road is hard, and says that whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. So rest then is not as we imagine rest, lying down, doing nothing, like when we sleep, or going on a holiday and lazing around with a good book. This language that Jesus uses is similar to the language used in Exodus and recalls Moses' own vocation. To ease Moses' anxiety about the uncertainty of the wilderness journey, God promises to accompany God's people along the way. My presence will go with you, God says to Moses, and I will give you rest. God will fulfill the promise for his people whose existence has known little rest, first wandering, then exile, and then captivity. Rest also makes us think of the rest that God decreed once creation was completed in Genesis chapter 2. Jesus then offers the rest which only the God of all creation can extend to a weary Israel longing for the paradise of the promised land. There is still a yoke. There is still a burden to carry. But Jesus says it is a light one. What then, I wonder, does he mean when many of our burdens do not feel light at all? Maybe it's about distinguishing between burdens that are worth carrying and those that are not. There is still a burden, there are still weights to be lifted, but these burdens are worth lifting. It's worth carrying the weight of our children and our relationships. It's worth carrying the weight of fighting for justice and peace and love in this world. Some worries are worth the burden, and we live in the tension of carrying loads and yet finding rest as we carry them. By its very nature, the yoke that animals wear on their necks attaches them to the plough, but it also attaches them to each other. Carrying our burdens with and for one another can make them lighter. Perhaps the burdens are also lighter by knowing that we are not in charge and God is. And perhaps it is when we don't carry these burdens in relationship with God that they feel heavy. As disciples, we don't simply attempt to duplicate the actions of an absent God. Instead, we rely on the ongoing presence of Jesus through the Spirit. It is precisely in a life of discipleship, which includes the making of other disciples, that Jesus' presence is guaranteed. And we see this in the way that Matthew's gospel is drawn to an end. Instead of ending with Jesus' departure, it ends with the assurance of his ongoing presence. I am with you even to the end of the age, he says. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Amen. Let's take a moment of stillness.